Demetri Sevastopulo, I want to ask you, you're the US China correspondent for the Financial Times, and you've got some really important new reporting, which I briefly mentioned at the top of the show, but hugely significant. You're reporting that Iran is using a Chinese spy satellite to target US bases. Okay, explain what you know and the obvious thing here about why this is so important.
Well, I think the important point, Erin, is that in recent weeks and even last year, we've had stories about Chinese satellite companies providing satellite imagery to the Iranians. But those are actually pictures they then transmit across. What we have here is the Iranians have signed a contract with a relatively new Chinese company called Empasat. And that contract gives the Iranians, the Iranian military specifically, not only access to the satellite, they essentially can control the satellite. They input task orders, they tell the satellite where to look, when to look. And, you know, we obtained information showing what they were looking at and what they asked the satellite to do. And we found that they targeted, or they looked down on American US targets in the region, particularly last month. We have data for about a week. And they then hit some of those targets after they had looked down on them. And so I think this is very consequential because what we know is now the Chinese are providing the Iranians with access to control a satellite themselves that is just for them. And that's significant.
Yeah, absolutely. As you point out, that is distinct from just providing pictures that China may choose to provide, like allowing Iran to control the satellite, to take the pictures themselves, to do the targeting. You mentioned that it was U.S. bases, that you were able to look at data where you could see that the Iranians were using that satellite to look at U.S. bases that they then later targeted. I want to put up a map that you and your colleagues made. These are key sites in the region that you saw the satellite look at that were targeted. One of the crucial pieces here is that air base in Saudi Arabia, which Iran has targeted at least twice, and with devastating precision, right? Devastating precision on one of those key command and control spy planes, right? Where they didn't just hit the plane on the runway, they hit the part of the plane where the controls were. Obviously, incredible precision on that. How was the satellite used for those? Do you understand?
Well, what we were able to ascertain, both in terms of information we received, which we corroborated by looking at where the satellite was at certain points of time in its orbit, is on March 13th, 14th, and 15th, that satellite, which is called the T-01B, was looking down at the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. We believe that the attack on the 5 refueling tankers happened on March 13th. So it gave them a precise look at a big American target. And another thing that's worth mentioning is, you know, Iran has some satellite capabilities itself, although some have been degraded. But the resolution that they can get is not very good. This Chinese satellite has resolution that's at least 10 times better, and in some cases more, than the Iranian satellites. It can see down to about half a meter. So that gives you a really good ability to target, you know, the things that you want to hit.
Yeah, well, and when you talk about targeting the exact part of the plane you want to target, which they did, you know, so Captain Schuster, I mean, this is obviously hugely significant. And the White House is specifically saying that China's provided no weapons to Iran. And maybe they're being, you know, rhetorical with their words, right, to try to not characterize a satellite as a weapon. But the question, Captain, is can Iran use the satellite, as Demetri's describing it, to target U.S. ships involved in the blockade of ports? I mean, he's talking about half a meter. It would seem that that would be very doable.
Well, on the surface, yes. But remember, you have the missile's accuracy as well. And when you're launching against a moving target, you got to pick an aim point that's 10 to 12 minutes ahead. And that distance could be 1,500 yards. And so if the missile warhead is only accurate to within 30 meters or 10 meters, then you have a shot. Plus, a warship, particularly an Aegis class ship, has the ability to intercept the missile. So it's a threat. I don't want to denigrate it, but it's not as serious as for a fixed target like an airfield. Iran's strategy is inflict damage. Every critical platform they hit or even near miss delivers a political message back in the United States. We no longer produce RC-135s. We no longer produce E-3s. So everyone they take out is years away from being replaced. So it's a political message. Think of it that way.
There's also new reporting that in addition to China supplying or attempting to supply Iran with military weapons and missiles, that Iran has been using newly acquired Chinese spy satellites to specifically target U.S. bases. So perhaps it is understandable why the president doesn't want to address these issues publicly. But in terms of what he needs to do when he speaks with Xi Jinping about all of these concerns, what lines need to be drawn about what is acceptable and what isn't? And what should the consequences be aside from his consistent tariff threats?
Well, I think that's a very good question, Brianna. And, I think that President Trump is well within his rights when he is speaking to President Xi Jinping to say, look, we're trying to stabilize U.S.-China relations. That's the whole point of President Trump's visit there. They want to have a truce on tariffs, a truce on supply chains. They want to get back to a more stable commercial and political relationship. And I think the U.S. has a strong point to make. The Chinese have denied these allegations that they're providing military support for Iran. Well, we hope that those Chinese denials are accurate, that they haven't been doing it. I don't know where the truth is here, but the onus is on China now not to become a contributing factor to the problems in this war as the U.S. administration thinks about a second round of negotiations with the Iranians.
You brought up an interesting point, Ambassador, in your first answer, this idea that perhaps that sort of 10% that China gets from Iran, 10% of its oil supply that it gets from Iran is hopefully, according to the U.S.'s calculations, going to be enough to really put pressure on China to persuade the Iranians to come to the negotiating table. Is that likely to happen based on what we know about China?
I don't think it'll happen in the short term because of the reserves that the Chinese have. And some of the vessels that did sail through the Strait of Hormuz in the last few weeks before the blockade were Chinese vessels of COSCO, the Chinese state shipping company, going with oil to the Chinese market. So this will only play out as an action-forcing event for the Chinese, the lack of Iranian oil in about 30 or 40 days' time. So it's a longer time framework here. But I do think the Chinese have to think about their larger interests. If they want a stable relationship with the United States, they ought not to be giving support to the Iranians, and they should be pushing the Iranians to agree to a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire with the United States. And, we do know there's a strategic relationship among China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. That's very well known. I don't think the Chinese can have it both ways. The other example of this, China, for most of the last 20 years, was on our side of the table, arguing that Iran should not have a nuclear weapon. The Chinese haven't said a word in defense of the U.S. and Europe and Japan and other countries who are arguing that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. They've gone silent on that. So I find a basic hypocrisy in the Chinese position. Maybe that's not surprising in global politics, but it's still something that should be noted.
And despite the public posturing, there has to be some concern for Xi Jinping to see how quickly the United States was able to act in Venezuela, which had been a partner for China as well, and then now closing and controlling the Strait of Hormuz. I'm wondering, again, as Zane noted, the perfect guest for this segment, because you also served as U.S. ambassador to NATO, whether it then is a gift for Xi Jinping to see the growing rift between the United States and NATO really play out, first over Greenland, now obviously only exacerbated with the war in Iran, and Europe, with Germany signing off on this, reportedly openly drafting a European NATO fallback plan if indeed the United States starts to pull troops back or play a lesser role in the alliance. What does that mean for players like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping?
It's a really important question, and I think it works both ways, actually. I think on the negative side for the Chinese, they didn't stand up for Venezuela, and they couldn't do much to protect Iran. They're two strategic partners. And they've also seen the extraordinary effectiveness and professionalism of the United States military in both of these theaters. So that has to be kind of a lesson for them. But as you say, we've made our own mistakes. I think it's been a major mistake by President Trump and the American administration to be so critical of the NATO allies. They didn't inform the NATO allies of this war. They didn't even invite NATO to take part. It was only when we got into trouble in the Strait of Hormuz they did. So, of course, the Chinese are going to take advantage of this rift in NATO. And it's really in President Trump's interest to put aside his grievances with the alliance, form a bigger coalition, try to work with the Europeans on what happens after the ceasefire. Same is true of our East Asian allies, Japan and South Korea. So the Chinese are trying to exploit that. President Xi Jinping trying to say to the rest of the world, I'm now the responsible, stable global leader. President Trump is not. So I do think there are positives and negatives if you're looking at where the Chinese are trying to gain from this. And we should not be giving gifts to the Chinese by having these, I think, quite illogical arguments with the NATO allies. We need NATO, and we ought to be more respectful of NATO as we go through this.
Yeah, and it's worth noting for our international audience that in order for the US to pull out of NATO, Trump would actually need Congress, it would need the US Senate, but as both you and Biana pointed out, Trump can essentially just sort of contribute less and less and less to the alliance, which is, of course, still a massive problem and something that NATO allies, of course, want to avoid. Ambassador, thank you for your very sensible analysis. We appreciate it. We hope to have you on again, the show, very soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.